Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. You're with Give the People What They Want, your weekly movement news roundup with Zoe from People's Dispatch. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. I'm really happy to be with you. It's our 173rd episode at the end of May. Right on the top of the agenda for the world is the situation in Ukraine. Things are beginning to escalate pretty quickly. The Russian military, which had entered Ukraine in February of 2022, holding very large sections of Donetsk, of Lugansk, making a land bridge through Mariupol to Crimea, has now escalated the conflict in the north of Ukraine, threatening the city of Kharkiv, entering parts of other areas in the north. Responding to this, the Ukrainian government has sought permission to use arms delivered by Western countries, particularly by the United States, to attack targets inside Russia. In other words, if Russia fires a missile towards Kharkiv, the Ukrainians want permission to use the US supplied weaponry against Russian targets on Russian soil. This would be a serious escalation of the use of NATO provided weaponry into Russia. It would mean that Russia might escalate against NATO countries directly. Very threatening scenario and situation. Meanwhile, the Swedish government has provided AWAC planes. These are surveillance planes directly to the Ukrainians. It is not really clear whether these planes would be flown by Swedes or by the Ukrainians. If by Swedes, then again, NATO is escalating into this conflict. Foreign ministers of NATO countries are on their way to Prague, Czechoslovakia, to have a meeting. They are going to discuss some of these issues, whether escalation is to be permitted. Meanwhile, peace talks are being pushed by the Chinese. In February, the Chinese released a 12-point principle for peace, which included things like ceasefire, included things like protecting grain shipments, included de-escalation mechanisms, and so on. This was a list of principles, wasn't by itself a peace proposal. Based on it, the Chinese hoped that there would be some movement between the Ukrainians and the Russians to seek some kind of dialogue. Well, that dialogue is long off the table. Next month in June, there will be a meeting in Switzerland, which is brokered by the Swiss government. Now, lest you have forgotten this, Switzerland used to be a neutral country, was neutral in World War I, neutral in World War II, and so on. Not neutral now. In fact, the Swiss have fully backed the Ukrainians. Nonetheless, they are holding a meeting in Bern. The Ukrainians want very much Joe Biden to come to that meeting. But because Mr. Biden is facing a difficult election campaign in the United States, most likely he's just going to send Antony Blinken on behalf of the United States. Very difficult to see Mr. Biden coming. But why Zelensky of Ukraine wants Biden of the United States at that meeting is to show that the United States is fully behind Ukraine. The Ukrainians also wanted the Chinese at that meeting. The Chinese have now declined to come to that meeting. Russia, in fact, was not even invited. Vladimir Putin was recently in Beijing meeting Xi Jinping. They went over their no limits partnership. That's the name of the agreement that they signed just weeks before Russia entered Ukraine. They talked about the trade, which is now at about $250 to $240 billion a year. They talked about the increase of the use of the renminbi to reconcile their trade. They are no longer using the dollar. These were things on the table, including the possibilities of peace. Looks unlikely. Looks like Russia right now has the upper hand on the battlefield. The Ukrainians seeking more weaponry from the West. The United States, in response to the Chinese peace plan, put $61 billion on the table for more arms to go to Ukraine. This was the exact opposite of a peace proposal. United States not keen on peace in Ukraine. The Chinese trying to push a peace agreement. On the battlefield itself, the situation dire. If there is an escalation, NATO countries directly entering the conflict, once more, there is a real danger of the expansion of this war. Zoe, this war, its expansion. Meanwhile, yesterday in Argentina, a very important person decided that her life was no longer to be lived at the age of 94. Nora Cortinas, Norita, passed away. Quite an extraordinary figure. We've all met her. If you've been to any protest in Argentina, you've run across her. I've met her at the Plaza de the Madres, the mother, the Plaza of the Mothers. Met her in front of the legislative building at protest. A real sentinel for peace, freedom, development, and justice left us yesterday on the 30th of May. Zoe, tell us a little bit about Norita and about the situation in Argentina.
Well, Norita was one of those people that, every single action, she would be there. So whether it was outside the police station when people had gotten arrested in a demo, she would be yelling at the police officers, telling them to release the students or the workers or whoever was arrested. Norita, Nora Cortinas, she entered a life of activism from, quite a comfortable middle-class home, but her son was involved in activism during the dictatorship. He was part of the armed movement against the dictatorship, and he was disappeared in 1977. And Nora, along with hundreds of other mothers and family members, was part of this group that was going every single Thursday to the Casa Rosada to demand answers about her son. If you ever saw Nora, she was always wearing around her neck a photo of her son, Gustavo, in this eternal search for justice, in this eternal demand for truth and memory of the 30,000 people that were disappeared during the dictatorship. Nora was present in the struggles of the indigenous people in Argentina against mining, against open pit mining. She was at all of the protests for the Palestinian people outside the Israeli embassy. And I'll note she was 94 when she passed away. At the end of her life, she was going everywhere in a wheelchair, and still she went to every single protest. And there's some beautiful quotes of hers saying, like, even if she feels tired, the next day she wakes up and her energy is renewed because of the strength of the people and because of her conviction for justice. She said that her son was disappeared, and the sons and daughters of so many other people were disappeared, and the mothers have taken up their struggle and continued forward. And she said that seeing all of the young people joining the struggle, protesting against Milei's policies, protesting and demanding dignified life, gave her hope as well and energy to continue, knowing that the struggle of her son, the struggle of that whole generation that was annihilated in Argentina, is now being taken up once again by the youth. So really such a loss to the people of Argentina, but it's someone who contributed so much. Someone I think we can all really look to for inspiration and for hope. Her legacy is not one that will go away. She really, if you've been to any protest, again, there's this beautiful moment where the mothers arrive to any protest, and immediately everyone steps aside and makes a pathway for the mothers to walk through and get to the plaza, and they chant, "Mothers of the Plaza, the people embrace you." So really such an important figure. And I think she ignited and she gave a lot of confidence to people to continue the struggle against Milei's policies. We know that since he assumed office in December 2023, things have been taking a nosedive, to really just put it that way. Not only have tens of thousands of people lost their jobs, of course, the formal positions that they had, government jobs, public sector jobs, but of course, the devaluation of the currency, the cuts to subsidies, the cuts to social programs. A lot of people who are employed in the informal sector, a lot of people who worked with different organizations that received money from the government. We've seen reports this past week of hundreds of community kitchens that have had to close because the Milei government has cut all of the funding for these social programs. So a very difficult moment in Argentina. But I think while the passing of Norita is so difficult and leaves such a gap, I think that, again, remembering her struggle has really ignited people, and given them that hope to continue, which will be necessary for the next years of government of Milei. I mean, he's making alliances with some of the worst people, not only in Argentina, but globally. We know that the deals he's made with Elon Musk regarding lithium in the north of Argentina, we definitely have to continue covering that. That is a story of a process of our time, important to follow. The deals he's made, of course, to the U.S. military, these are not small things. So the struggle continues. The legacy of Nora continues. But really encourage you all to look up Norita Cortinas. The images of her smile in the middle of these protests is something that I think will put a smile on everyone's face in these hard times.
It's important to recognize that in 2020, she released a very strong statement on behalf of the Palestinian people. Unlike the current president of Argentina, Javier Milei, who is backing fully the Israeli assault, which of course continues, the assault on Rafah continuing deeply, the United States backing Israel, despite Biden having said that there's a red line, the buffer zone between the Gaza Strip and Egypt now taken over by the Israelis. They have actually moved in to that area. They continue to bomb Rafah. 12 people died overnight. This bombing has not ended on the edges of Rafah. The Israelis continue to basically say that they are pursuing the Palestinian group Hamas, but thus far there is little indication that Hamas is being wiped out completely. This particular assault on Rafah comes right after the International Court of Justice explicitly called upon Israel to halt the attacks. They said they will not do so. Since May 6th, they said they've killed 300 Palestinian gunmen. What would be interesting, in fact, for journalists is if the Israelis could release the names of the 300 Palestinian gunmen that they have claimed to kill, so that this could be independently verified, to see whether these are Hamas fighters or Islamic Jihad fighters or whoever they are, or they are civilians. We can't verify this number because we don't have from the Israelis the list of people that have been killed. Thus far, again, the United States fully behind the Israeli assault, but nonetheless, the US has been speaking through Egypt and Qatar, seeing if they can mediate indirect talks one way or the other. I don't really think this is going to happen at all. I mean, there's really been no movement from the Israeli side regarding any kind of movement. Meanwhile, this conflict isn't just remaining in Gaza. It has, of course, been there very much in the West Bank. 2 Israeli soldiers, in fact, were killed overnight in the West Bank when a Palestinian drove a car into them. This is creating its own tensions and its own worries. The Palestinians have been facing direct assaults in the West Bank, not only from formal Israeli troops, but from the illegal settlers who have been coming in armed and burning olive groves and so on. So the conflict is, in fact, not remained in Rafah. It is extended into the West Bank. The conflict continues in northern Gaza, where there are still sporadic bombings by the Israeli forces. Palestinians continue to get killed. You'll notice that the numbers of dead, numbers that we've been playing around with, it's become now sort of almost something that people very much don't pay attention to. but the numbers are very important to look at. I mean, there right now verified 36,171 dead in the West Bank. 519 people have died. 75% of the people killed in Gaza, women and children. The numbers are extraordinary. 3,273 families have been killed. And what I find most disturbing is the other number, is that the UN agencies have said that 1 million refugees have had to be re-evacuated out of Rafah to other parts of Gaza. They're not being allowed to cross the border. That's 1 million people. It's no small number in the numbers of this conflict. That is something that has been quite atrocious. And of course, Nora Cortinas stood with the Palestinians right till the very end. You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. Today, that's Zoe. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Really happy to be with you. Zoe, there was a big meeting in Detroit, Michigan, the Palestine conference. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened there and what were some of the outcomes?
Yes, last weekend, the People's Conference for Palestine took place in Detroit. 3 days of very intense discussion and presentations, debate, exchange. Definitely something historic, which I don't think we've seen in the recent history in the United States. Over 3,500 people coming together in a U.S. city to unequivocally say free Palestine from the river to the sea. This is definitely something remarkable. The movement on the streets for the past 8 months has really turned the tides in the U.S. Regarding public opinion about Palestine and regarding people's position and actually how far they're willing to go. Vijay, you know well that perhaps 10 years ago, trying to get more than 50 people to a protest, even during a bombing, was difficult. And so this shift in perception and the visibility of the Palestinian cause and the centrality and how people are relating it is so crucial. And so this conference sort of attempted to channelize a lot of that energy and to build the movement going forward. There were really, really interesting talks, people speaking from Gaza itself, from the West Bank, talking about the situation on the ground in Palestine. I think I really recommend people to read some of the transcripts of speeches that we have up on People's Dispatch. Check out the live streams on Breakthrough News. Really interesting, critical look at the movement for Palestinian liberation, of course, within Palestine since the Oslo Accords, and how since October 7th, we really have seen the concretization of this new stage of struggle. And of course, internationally, the reactivation of diaspora and the solidarity movement taking sort of a different level of protagonism. So very, very interesting. Some of the key outcomes, of course, the June 8th protests at the White House. Many people pointing out that actually Joe Biden has been saying for months, really, the invasion of Rafah was announced by Netanyahu back in February, if people remember it. And since then, agency after UN agency has been saying what a catastrophe this would be. Different aid groups that have been running their operations, as we've covered on this show, out of Rafah, saying that this would completely collapse the distribution of humanitarian aid to other parts of the enclave. Not to mention, of course, the high concentration and density of the people there. And Joe Biden, because of all this pressure, was really forced to actually say, okay, the invasion of Rafah is going to be the red line. If this happens, I have no other choice but to take strong measures against Israel. And actually, Israel has begun this invasion. It on Sunday bombed a displaced persons camp, killing 36 people. Horrific images that we've seen across social media and across the news. And Joe Biden has not budged. And in fact, spokespersons of the White House, spokespersons of the State Department have said, well, actually, this is not how we define the red line. It has to actually be a bit further. so many people are asking, okay, what is this extremely specific red line? How many children have to die? How many, refugee camps have to be bombed for Joe Biden to actually end all U.S. aid to Israel? And so there's going to be a mass protest on June 8th. Another concrete outcome of this conference is a new campaign against Maersk, which is one of the largest logistics companies, shipping companies in the world, that runs, of course, many of the weapons shipments from across the world to Israel. There's going to be a large campaign involving unions, involving mass organizations across the US, and I think it will be also international, to actually target the arms trade and shipments to Israel. So really, really important. And people can definitely stay tuned. We'll be covering June 8th in the lead up and during it on the ground. These are important. Of course, Joe Biden has been forced to make serious concessions to what the U.S. position has historically been because of the pressure from the streets. So this is going to continue. People are planning on amping up the pressure because it is not going to be through his conscience that he changes the position of sending aid to Israel. So interesting things to follow there.
Very interesting, very important. We shall see, of course, in the middle of all this, Donald Trump has been convicted of 39 counts in a courtroom in New York. Will this impact the election? People are saying Joe Biden might be the first person running for re-election in the United States who loses to a convicted criminal. So let's see what happens there. Speaking of elections, two more stories about elections, Zoe. Why don't you take us into the Mexican election first, and then I'll come in briefly on the South African election. I know this election in Mexico is of great significance. It's about who's going to follow the very successful tenure of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. So give us a quick report from Mexico, that election, and then we go to South Africa.
Well, we couldn't neglect the elections, which is, of course, our favorite topic on this show, but not in the way that, of course, bourgeois media covers it. We are here to uncover what is behind these processes and what it means for the future of these countries and the world. But interestingly enough, yesterday, Gallup polls, which is world-renowned and recognized, released a poll that President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador ends his term as president with one of the highest approval ratings of any sitting president, I think, 80%. 80%, a hugely high number. And in this poll, it also says that when he came to office in December 2018, 29% of the people in Mexico had faith in the government. So this is clearly, from 29% to 80%, huge departure, and clearly based on the policies that he implemented during his tenure as president. We've covered it many, many times, and we were lucky enough to actually sit down with Claudia Sheinbaum last year to hear a little bit about the fourth transformation, this project of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador and the Morena Party. What does this mean for the people of Mexico? Sheinbaum, of course, the continuation of this project of the fourth transformation, her campaign coalition called Let's Continue Making History. So really, really important election there. What does it mean to continue the legacy of AMLO? Interestingly enough, as we've seen in many other electoral processes, when it seems like defeat is near, what is the possibility for these right-wing candidates? Well, intent to create this fraud narrative. So we've seen that Xochitl Galvez, who is, again, the candidate of PRI and PAN, really just go all out attempting to build this narrative of fraud, to say that Claudia Sheinbaum and Morena are liars. She has this whole slogan that she's the candidate of lies. Attempting to do this sort of Hail Mary campaign against the legitimacy of this electoral process. But as we know, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of electoral observers in this electoral process. The fact of the matter is that there's 80% approval rating for the Morena government. Claudia Sheinbaum has essentially been anointed by AMLO as his successor. She won the internal consultation within Morena. There's very little doubt of the feelings of the people in the country, and the fact that they are outrightly rejecting what were the decades and decades of pre and pan governments, which for the people of Mexico meant bad working conditions, widespread corruption, collusion with criminal gangs, accusations which Xochitl Galvez has attempted to wield against Claudia Sheinbaum, saying, it's not us, it's you. You're actually the one who's been involved in all these different cases. But of course, there are convictions from Mexican courts, there are convictions from US courts, which essentially say the exact opposite. So I think things to look out for this Sunday, these accusations of fraud coming from the right wing. This is going to be rampant. We also know that the United States has been running its own media campaign, and of course our not favorite paper of record, the New York Times, attempting to malign the image of AMLO, saying that, publishing a report a couple months ago is saying that someone once investigated whether or not he had ties to criminal gangs, but of course, made this whole piece of it saying that he does have ties. All of that is important to keep in mind when following these results. But I think that the facts on the ground will speak for themselves.
Well, whatever happens on Sunday, Mexico will have a woman as the president. That's something that the United States, which is north of the border, will envy, I'm sure. Situation in South Africa, also on Sunday, we'll get the results most likely. 70% of the voting has been done. Looks now like the African National Congress Alliance is sitting at about 42 to 43%, unlikely to come to 50%. One of the real reasons why the ANC has been hit hard is the expulsion of former President Jacob Zuma, led Mr. Zuma to create his own party, the MK, which has triumphed in KwaZulu-Natal, the province from which Mr. Zuma hails. But also there's some loss of the ANC in Gauteng, for instance, the economic heartland in Gauteng. The Democratic Alliance, which is the old white party, has made some significant gains against the African National Congress. Unemployment is very high. The African National Congress has done a very poor job as a government when it comes to electricity. These are things that have turned off people from the rule of President Cyril Ramaphosa. For the first time in 30 years, the African National Congress Alliance will fail to get above 50%. This is quite stunning. Now, the debate in South Africa has moved from what is the election result going to be what is the coalition going to look like. Very clear now that the ANC-led alliance is not going to go above 50%. It has been punished at the polls, but it is still going to be the largest party. It might come close to 45% of the electorate. That's still considerable. The closest party after that, the Democratic Alliance, the largely white party, is somewhere around 22 to 23%, about half of what the ANC will have won. But still, the ANC alliance short by 5-6% of the 50% mark to have a majority in parliament to elect its own president from there. Who will it ally with? That's the big question and debate. Unlikely that Mr. Zuma will enter an alliance with the ANC unless there are major apologies and enormous concessions made to him. The economic freedom fighters led by former ANC youth leader Julius Malema has said he's open to an alliance, but also unlikely. Now, the Democratic Alliance, the White Party, has said it will not deal with economic nationalists. That means that the DA will not ally with either the economic freedom fighters or Mr. Zuma, both of whom have called for land nationalization. It is most likely that the ANC alliance will turn to smaller parties, maybe even the Inkatha Freedom Party, which will win about 3 or 4% of the vote, which might be sufficient. There are a number of small parties. This election saw the largest number of parties compete. Mr. Ramaphosa might be faced to make serious concessions to these little parties to cobble together a 50 plus 1% majority and then govern from a position of weakness. Be very interesting times in South Africa, certainly, but we won't have the final result till Sunday. That means next week, Zoe, lots of election results. India, South Africa, Mexico, three major countries in the global south will have new leaders. We'll be here, give the people what they want. Coming to you from People's Dispatch, that's Zoe. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. It'll be election season next Friday. See you then.